Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart, and this week we're delving into SETI, the organisation that handles the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And just to introduce this, 74 years ago in 1950, a physicist by the name of Enrico Fermi was sitting in the canteen at the Los Alamos National Laboratory canteen, and he was having lunch. And he posited with his colleagues, if the universe is as vast as we understand it is, and there must be technological advanced civilizations out there in vast numbers, where the hell are the aliens? And it's a very good question. And SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has been asking that question for quite a number of decades now. It started out as NASA funded, and then the bean counters cut that funding. And thanks very much, particularly to Microsoft's Paul Allen, there's been funding that has continued to keep the SETI Institute going. And the current CEO of the SETI Institute and president is Bill Diamond. And Bill's hugely experienced in photonics, optical communications. He's worked across venture-backed startups and huge multinationals. And he's also worked in X-ray and semiconductor processing technologies. And he joins us now. Bill, welcome to Reality Check.
Ross, wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Bill, can I first get you to give me, I was trying to figure it out this morning as I was going through my research. I was trying to figure out, is SETI just focused on radio waves, observing the spectrum of radio wave transmissions coming from the universe, or is it also looking at optical signals?
Well, it's actually doing both of those, but also more. So the SETI Institute is, its name brand activity, if you will, is SETI, which is an endeavor using modern technology to look for engineered phenomena in interstellar space, basically beyond our solar system, which would serve as a proxy for life and intelligence. And that phenomena could be a radio transmission, it could be a laser pulse, it could be laser communication or lasers used for propulsion. But since the Institute's founding 40 years ago, the search for signs of technology or signs or evidence of engineered phenomena has broadened to include what we now call technosignatures. And a technosignature could include even some bizarre phenomena that we observe that appears to maybe be something like a Dyson sphere or some engineered structure surrounding its host star to provide a planet with boundless energy. So we use both optical telescopes and radio telescopes to look for specific kinds of electromagnetic phenomena. But then more broadly, we're involved in the field of so-called astrobiology, which is the study of life in the universe, which really starts with basic questions about what is a habitable planet, how does life start, under what conditions, and where else might those conditions exist where we could find even basic life, and perhaps even in our own solar system. These could be, microbes or even multicellular organisms.
Now, back in 2004, astronomer Seth Shostak made a prediction that I suspect he'll rue he ever made. Never make a bet about astronomy. And he bet basically, or he predicted in 2004 that he expected to get a conclusive signal and proof of alien contact sometime between 2020 and 2025 based on the Drake equation. And to date, there's been no such evidence. The Drake equation, of course, is a calculation by Frank Drake, one of the originators, the conceivers of the SETI idea, that essentially, when you look at all of the variables that exist in the universe, there's an extremely high likelihood that there are technologically advanced civilizations out there. Now, to date, of course, we're coming up to 2025 very, very soon. As best as we understand it, Bill, unless you guys are hiding something, there's been no evidence. So are we looking for the wrong thing? Is there something we're missing that might be hindering that search?
Sure. I think I share Seth's perspective that we are probably on the cusp of making such a discovery. But I would say that's as much to do with simply deploying more technologies, more capable technologies, more eyes and ears on the sky, if you will, at more times of day and night and in more places in the world than ever before. So that increases the odds. But we do have a fundamental limit that I think is not really something people understand. And that is um, the planet that we're on, Earth, has been emitting electromagnetic signals in the form of radio and then television and other types of communication. Now, even things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, although very low energy. But we've been doing this for 100 years. So we're 100 years into being, quote unquote, a technological civilization, if we think of the invention of the radio as starting that clock. And if we were to be looking for another planet like Earth that is simply leaking radiation of this kind at fairly low energies and in all directions, using the instruments we have today, radio telescopes, including some of the most sensitive in the world, we'd only be able to find a similar kind of planet doing similar kinds of things within 10 or 20 light years, which isn't very far. Our own galaxy.
Why is that, Bill? What are the constraints on our technology?
Sensitivity, just the the kind of energy levels of the electromagnetic radiation that we generate from Earth. It dissipates rapidly, and so it's too weak to transmit across vast distances of space.
So the closest star, I think, is Alpha Centauri. Is Alpha Centauri close enough for us to be able to detect radio transmissions that might be being emitted from that cluster?
Yeah, so if there were similar levels of radio transmission or electromagnetic phenomena at similar energies to what we produce coming from that location, yes, we could detect it. And similarly, part of the premise of SETI is the notion that a sufficiently advanced civilization may actually be, particularly broadcasting high energy, targeted radio waves or optical signals that, would have sufficient energy to be detected across the galaxy even. So it isn't as though our search is only limited to 10 or 20 light years out. It's just that if we were, looking for other examples of a planet like Earth where we are not actually directing high energy beacons across the galaxy, then, we can only locate quite nearby planets.
Now, Bill, one of my favorite movies is Contact, the Jodie Foster movie that's set, I think it's set around Arecibo, the Puerto Rico dish. And I think it also uses the Very Large Array down in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And it's such an inspiring movie talking about the possibilities of extraterrestrial intelligence attempting to communicate with our planet. And the thing that I loved in that film was it postulated a White House that meddles. And I remember there was a villain called, I think, Drumfield,
Mhm.
and he's the bad guy who's trying to stop Jodie Foster from being the one that goes on the mission. And it's all these religious fundamentalists in the Congress who are offended by the idea that there might be aliens, and they're trying to conceal it from the public. Tell me, sir, what protections do you have in place? Do you promise me if you find an extraterrestrial technosignature, are you going to have some cad from the White House on your shoulder saying, you are not going to tell the public about this? Tell us, what's the procedure in place, Bill? How does it happen?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. We get that question all the time. We are not a government agency. We do have government funding from NASA and from the National Science Foundation and other government organizations for some of the work we do, but not for SETI, not for the work we do with radio and optical telescopes. That's all privately funded. So the government has no control over what we do. We own our own telescope array. We use the Very Large Array. Actually, it wasn't being used for SETI at the time of the movie Contact. It had never been used for SETI, but we actually have a project on the VLA right now, which is maybe the most comprehensive SETI program ever undertaken by the human species. We can talk more about that later. But our protocol, first and foremost, would be that if we made an observation of a signal which A, appeared to be, a technical engineered phenomenon and not something that nature produces, and B, was perceived by our instruments to be from beyond our solar system, so something, from another star system, beyond our own, then step one would be to get another radio observatory elsewhere on the planet to point their instruments at the same place and see if they see or hear the same phenomena. And part of the reason for doing that is that if we're looking at something and we think it's fairly far away, and another telescope in another part of the Earth looks in the same coordinates we give them and get the same signal, that verifies that it's far away. If we give them the same coordinates and they don't see it, that's because it's coming from closer by. And then we would know, oh, this must be a satellite or, some other local phenomena. So step one, verification. Step two, announcement. But the announcement, I think, in the traditions of science, would be as fact-based and informationally accurate as possible, with perhaps, minimum speculation. In other words, we would say, this is what we have observed. We appear to have received a signal from whatever, let's say 20 light years from Earth, and it is this kind of a signal. It is modulated in this manner. It appears to contain information, or at the very least, it appears to be something clearly engineered and not something nature produces. And therefore, it is, likely evidence of an alien technology. And so people say, well, would you be allowed to do that? If you were preparing to make such an announcement, would somebody step in and stop you? Of course, I can't predict what some future administration may or may not do, but, they wouldn't have any inside track on what we were about to do or say. We're not under any obligation to make any advance notifications to any government agency about any discovery we might make. So they would have no, heads up that this was coming. Secondly, I say this somewhat tongue in cheek, but I say to people, look, if you're concerned about that, the thing to do is to surround our building off of our property with cameras looking at our building at all times. And if you ever see a bunch of black Escalades pull up with a bunch of people with suits and earpieces and lapel pins pop out, you might assume that we got a signal. So, but no, we're pretty free and clear.
As you would probably know, we take a very close interest in Reality Check on the suspicion or the idea of a cover-up in government on the issue of UAPs. And I do. I do think the US government knows a lot more than it's letting on. I've got sources who tell me we have recovered non-human technology. Let me ask you this question. There's one thing that's always intrigued me, because I'm a keen fan. My brain can't quite get my head around it, but I'm a keen fan of the implications of quantum technology. And let me just work through this with you, and please shout at me if I say anything wrong here. As I understand it, there's a phenomenon in quantum science of quantum teleportation, which relies on the so-called entanglement of particles to transmit quantum information instantaneously and securely. And this entanglement of particles is so cool, and it's almost magic, because if you've got one particle here and another particle, say at Alpha Centauri, light years away, they would instantaneously do the same thing. Now, I looked online because I've always been intrigued by the possibility that this might be the way that aliens communicate. That here we are on the cusp of this amazing discovery about quantum telecommunication, the possibility that there is this other way of communicating that doesn't use radio waves or even visible light in the optical spectrum. And so, is there that possibility? I hear different arguments online. There's a whole Reddit string that says, no, quantum communication is not possible. It's absolutely not possible. You can't go faster than light. And then I was reading about this team of scientists from Edinburgh's School of Physics and Astronomy, and they have mathematically calculated that quantum communications across interstellar space should be possible. And they've used math to describe the movement of X-rays across a medium, such as that travels between stars. And they looked to see if their calculations could show the degree of decoherence that might occur during such a journey. And their math shows that space is clean enough to allow such interstellar quantum communications. So X-ray photographs could travel hundreds of thousands of light years without losing their coherence. Does this mean that there might be a form of communication that we're currently not looking for, quantum communication? And is there any way, Bill, of detecting it?
Sure. Well, it's a great question, and I'm not familiar with the paper you referenced from Scotland, but quantum entanglement is something that it occurs on a quantum scale. So we're talking about subatomic particles and their state, for example, their spin state, and how particles at vast distances, even across the length of the galaxy, never mind between here and Alpha Centauri, if they're entangled, can basically duplicate each other's state. Now, I'm not sure that entanglement provides the same ability to transmit information as we think about when we talk about transmitting information or teleporting information, because we're just talking about quantum states being entangled and instantaneously happening across vast distances. I think it's fair to say that we are sufficiently ignorant of the possibilities of things like quantum entanglement or quantum communications to say whether or not that would be a phenomena that we could look for. I think it's fair to say that at any given moment in time, we are only able to deploy the technologies that we have at our disposal to look for phenomena that we already understand and know about. And when you think about our existence as a technological civilization and being 100 years old, we think that statistically speaking, the probability or the likelihood is, if we do find evidence of an extraterrestrial civilization, they'd be most certainly much older than we are. Because the probability of 200-year-old civilizations finding one another in a 15 billion year old universe is like zero. But so they might be 1,000 years or 20 or 50,000, and I think it's difficult to imagine what kind of physics and deeper understanding they have of the natural world and its phenomena than we do. So one of the things we're endeavoring to do, for example, at the moment, is bring together theoretical physicists and SETI scientists and sort of reimagine SETI techniques and technologies based on different ideas of how information might get sent from point A to point B, and so forth. So I think it's fair to say that our search techniques and modalities are very limited. They're limited to technologies we have and understand, and that there are certainly going to be discoveries made in the decades ahead and centuries ahead that may completely turn on its head the science, if you will, and technology of SETI searches.
I am delighted to announce that we have a sponsor on Reality Check, and that sponsor is none other than a martial arts god that when I was a little boy, I worshipped intensely. I had his posters on my wall, and he inspired me to learn karate and other martial arts as a young teenager. I'm talking about Chuck Norris. When I was a little boy, there was one movie that I went to watch about 5 times in 1972 called The Way of the Dragon. And it was Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris facing off against each other in the Colosseum in Rome. It was just mighty stuff. And would you believe Chuck Norris is now 84 years old? And while I have broken hands and knees and ankles because of my foolish interest in karate, whacking boards in a dojo late into the night, Chuck Norris's body defies explanation. The man is 84 years old, and yet he's still got the vigor of a man 30 or 40 years younger than him. He's still kicking butt and working out. And what's amazing is he's stronger, he can work out longer, and has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He did this, he tells us, by making one change. And he says he still feels like he's in his 50s. His wife's even done the same thing as well, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger. Her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. And Chuck's made a special video that explains everything. And make sure you help us and Chuck by watching it. If you go to chuckdefense.com/Ross and click in the link below in this video, it'll change the way you think about your health. Now, once again, that's chuckdefense.com/Ross. Click on the link in the description below to watch the video. You won't believe how simple it is. Just a reminder, the legendary Chuck Norris is a whopping 84 years old, and yet he's got more energy than me. And his body may be broken, but for some reason, he seems to be able to keep on going. I want to know his secret. I'm going to click on that link. What he's discovered that he could effect dramatic changes to his health simply focusing on 3 things that sabotage our body as we age. Watch his method by clicking on the link in the box below, chuckdefense.com/Ross. Broadly speaking, putting the quantum communications question aside for a moment, I guess what you're conceding there is the possibility that the aliens are using a technology that we just don't know about yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, think about, I mean, even what we now call optical SETI, the idea of looking in space for optical phenomena, specifically lasers. Lasers are also a very effective form of communication or propulsion or information transfer. We have a laser up the street from us here in Mountain View at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And that is the world's most powerful laser used for high energy, basically fusion, energy fusion research. And if you took the output of that laser and bounced it off of one of our 8-meter telescope mirrors on Earth and shot it into space, it would be 10,000 times brighter than the sun. So, lasers are, like radio waves, become an interesting phenomena to look for, but we couldn't have looked for them before we invented the laser and even knew such a thing existed. So, what kinds of technologies that have that capability to transmit information or just be observed from great distances, have we yet to develop or create that we could ultimately look for? So yes, I think at any given point in time, we're going to be limited to the physics and the technologies that we understand and have access to in terms of what we look for and how we go about that effort.
Just coming back to the quantum thing for a moment, you might be interested to know that the Edinburgh scientist, who's a guy called Latham Boyle, and he speculated that for interstellar quantum communication to occur, the wavelengths of the photons must be less than 26.5 centimeters to avoid interference with cosmic microwave background radiation. Mm-hmm. And he calculated that the telescope would have to be 100 kilometers in diameter. So you got any budget there for a 100-kilometer diameter telescope, Bill?
Not at our immediate disposal. However, the notion of telescopes that big, is surprisingly not just the stuff of science fiction. I mean, once you start talking about constructing things in space, scales like that are, not so crazy as they may sound. And of course, to build a 100-kilometer telescope on Earth would be impossible, just structurally impossible. But to build it in space where there's no gravity, you don't need, a big, strong, supportive frame or, things like that. So you can take, mylar thin films and create any shape you want and make it absolutely enormous. So it's not as crazy as it sounds, but it would be, if we talk about, having to build it on Earth, yeah, there are some constraints there that would make it difficult.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about, and please, I know you're being a really good sort by asking some of my questions because I'm really fascinated in this area. And one of the things that I was intrigued about, I was reading about something called ALBI, astronomically long baseline interferometry. And there's speculation that you could actually link telescopes across astronomical distances, creating what's called an effective angular resolution. Essentially,
Mhm.
you can create a gigantic telescope. And it was speculated when I was looking at this quantum communication idea, I was going to ask you about this possibility that maybe the aliens are just using a different type of telephone.
For sure.
And I read somewhere online that there is this speculation that you can use this interferometry to build a notionally large telescope. Is that something that's you believe possible? Is it something that you'd contemplate as a possibility if we could get the resources to do it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, so right now in radio astronomy, we already use arrays, and we have the Allen Telescope Array. You referenced Paul Allen first. That's the Institute's own array. It's 42 dishes. Each one is a separate dish, but they all act like one big dish, and they are integrated and collimated together so that they act in unison, and we can focus each one of those 42 dishes on precisely the same phenomena that we wish to observe. The Very Large Array in New Mexico is even bigger. Each telescope there is 25 meters across, and there's 27 of them, and they're spread over a distance about 23 miles across. And but they also have the VLBA, the Very Large Baseline Array, which combines some of the telescopes at the VLA with other radio telescopes across the United States in different locations, again, to function as a single large integrated instrument. So really all we're talking about is scaling phenomena and technology that we already know quite a lot about and we know how to do. One of the complexities about radio or even optical elements being far apart in terms of radio transmission, it's timing the data so that when you're transmitting data from one telescope thousands of miles away and you've got another telescope that's right in your backyard where your computers are, you have to time the observations precisely. Otherwise, you don't have an array. You don't have an integrated instrument. You have something looking at two different points in time. So there are complexities, but we understand them. We know how to do them. And so if you just say, okay, well, let's scale it up. Let's put a dish on the moon and then function that as an arrayed instrument with an instrument on the ground. And then you can scale beyond that. Well, okay, we could start using other bodies in the solar system. So it's not to say it's trivial nor inexpensive by any stretch, but it's absolutely technically feasible. And it's just scaling up something we already do and know how to do.
Bill, we had the wonderful Professor Avi Loeb from the Galileo project on this show a few months ago, and he was talking about the Oumuamua object that he's taken a huge interest in, which he speculated might be an artificial object because it didn't follow a normal kind of elliptical track through the solar system. And I read somewhere that SETI was used to direct its technology at the Oumuamua object to see whether there was any kind of emission that could be detected. As I understand it, you didn't find any evidence of ET.
No, we didn't. Of course, what's interesting that there are, of course, images or drawings that people have imagined of what Oumuamua looks like based on information we have. In reality, Oumuamua for astronomers was no more than a single pixel on a display. And just by looking at how that pixel changed in brightness, depending on when you were looking at it and so forth, we could determine a lot about it, but we couldn't see anything like, an actual structure. We could only infer its shape and size based on the way light was reflected off of this pixel. And there were no, radio emissions, at least that we could detect, coming from that object. So, I think, of course, when you're interested, as we absolutely share Avi's enthusiasm for this endeavor. And I think we're as passionate as he is about, how exciting and interesting this is. But I think we have to be careful about inferring too much, making too many conclusions based on scant evidence for what we're observing. And just because something doesn't move or behave in a manner that we expect, I don't think is a sufficient reason to draw the conclusion that, well, therefore it must be engineered. We've discovered all kinds of things that we didn't expect that would, for example, have defied our previous understandings of astrophysics, only to, realize these are normal. So, for example, the first exoplanets found were huge Jupiter-sized planets zipping around their host stars in a matter of days. And we would have thought, that's not even possible. So, but it is, and it's a natural phenomena. These are not spacecraft; they're big planets. So, I think it's always interesting to speculate on what could be. I think it's dangerous to declare what is based on very, let's say, scant information.
You just gave me the perfect segue into what I want to go on to next, because again, the wow signal has been an exact example, apparently, of exactly what you're just talking about. This idea that as our understanding of science develops, we do find explanations or possible explanations for what might originally have been thought to be an artificial signal. So just to give our audience a bit of background, in 1977, 15th of August, Ohio State University's Big Ear telescope picked up the so-called wow signal. And there was a scientist called Jerry Eman who wrote the word wow on a computer printout. And it was not an ordinary signal, an extremely powerful signal, in fact, in a protected area of radio technology. It looked technological, and it didn't appear to be of human origin. And I have to admit, Bill, I was crushed a few weeks ago when I read that it's now being suggested that the wow signal is not what we hoped it might be. It's not ET. Can you please explain?
Yes, well, of course, it was very exciting at the time. I mean, why the words wow were written on the margins of this computer printout. And, another thing some in the audience may not be familiar is that we used to get data on printouts instead of screens, so we're talking about a long time ago. And data was, astronomical observational data was strings of letters and numbers, printed across this green and dark and light green shaded paper. And there was this string of numbers on one line of the printout that when the astronomer went back to look at the printout in the morning to see what was seen, overnight, there was just this string that said, well, this is not normal. This is high energy. It's a particular frequency. Wow. So you just, like, as one does when maybe reading something interesting, make a note to yourself in the margins. He wrote the word wow and put exclamation point. The problem, of course, is at that time, there was no way to do anything like an immediate follow-up, or, there was nobody on duty to have the telescope, trace and track that and notify other observatories to maybe take a look. There probably weren't so many radio observatories at that time in any case. So, it's almost certain that what was seen was, a man-made, human-made phenomena. Could have been a satellite, could have been an aircraft, something along those lines. I mean, this is the one of the big challenges of SETI, is dealing with the vastly noisy radio frequency, so-called RF environment that we live in. That is, a noisy RF environment created by our own technology. So we really are at a needle in a haystack kind of endeavor with this kind of research.
I think there's a paper that I was reading about from the Planetary Habitability Lab at the University of Puerto Rico at Arecibo. And they did observations between 2017 and 2020, and they found wow-like signals near the hydrogen frequency spectrum of 1420 that looks exactly like wow. And this is why they're now hypothesizing that a transient radio source, and they think it might be some kind of magnetar firing or a soft gamma ray repeater, some kind of neutron star suddenly flared in the radio spectrum. And their hypothesis is that if it's in the right proximity to a cold hydrogen cloud, it could explain the wow signal. So it's not definitive, but that was the crushing paper that I read that suggested that they dismissed the idea, interestingly enough, that it might be a human transmission, but they were suggesting that it might just be a natural occurrence that essentially amplified a signal.
It could certainly be. I mean, and it isn't the first time we've had phenomena like that we've observed. And, we have even recently, in partnership with the Green Bank radio telescope at the Green Bank National Radio Astronomy Observatory, we've simultaneously observed the location coordinates for the WOW signal and, not seen anything. So it is almost certainly some either natural phenomena as described in the paper, or, a man-made transient that could have been, in low Earth orbit. It's hard to say with any certainty at this point. But an intriguing and much more recent analog to this is something called Tabby's star, which you may have heard of.
Can you pronounce that? Sorry?
Tabby. It's Tabitha, and it's named for a young undergraduate student astronomer at Yale University. And what she was doing was looking at data from the Kepler Space Telescope mission. That was a NASA mission that was run out of the NASA Ames Research Center right down the street from us. And actually the SETI Institute managed the data pipeline for that mission. And we wrote the algorithms for planet detection. The purpose of that mission was to find so-called exosolar planets, and in other words, planets around other stars. It did that using the so-called transit method. Basically look at a star and look at its brightness and stare at it for a long time, i.e. years. And if you have instruments that are sensitive enough to look at just the slightest amount of dimming of the light from that star that might be because of a planet transiting in front of it in our line of sight, and you see that happening with a regular periodicity or frequency, you might infer that this is a planet going around the star. And so that was the fundamental technology or idea behind the Kepler mission. Now, bear in mind, an Earth-like planet transiting a sun-like star would only dim the observed light from our sun, if it was being observed by somebody on Alpha Centauri, for example, by 1 part in 10,000. So very, very tiny amount. So very hard to see. Even a Jupiter-sized planet would be 1 part in 1,000. So just a slight dimming of a star, which you're still observing in the field of view of this telescope as a tiny little point. So extraordinary measurements. But there was a particular observation of a particular star in which this young woman discovered hidden in the data that there was something periodically dimming the light of this star by 20%, not 1/10,000th or 1/1000th, but 20%. And that gave rise to all kinds of speculation that it might be, for example, a Dyson sphere or some, engineered technology. And for the longest time, many, many months, I think maybe even more than a couple of years, there was no better explanation. Astronomers and astrophysicists were trying all kinds of ways to explain this than the idea that it might be an engineered phenomena. But, certainly there was a lot of skepticism that this might be the case. And now the prevailing theory, which, has been backed by a lot of analysis and mathematics and so forth, is that this is a cloud of dust that is moving around in an orbit that is blocking the light, which is disappointing if true. But it's another example of things that are unexpected and at least initially unexplained by our own understanding of physics and cosmology, and then turn out to be nature at work.
Do you find it frustrating, Bill, that you're doing a job where you've got one goal and you've been doing it now? I mean, obviously SETI's been doing it now for decades, but both with and without government funding, or with diminishing or diminution of government funding at different times. But there's obviously the one goal is obviously to discover extraterrestrial intelligence.
Right.
There's all these disappointments. I mean, you've just given me another one there. The WOW signal's another disappointment. I mean, do you ever feel like it's a futile task?
Well, I think the answer to its ultimate futility would lie in whether or not there are such extraterrestrial advanced civilizations out there. And what's interesting is, in only the last 15 years, do we now have irrefutable proof that planets are ubiquitous. We didn't know that. We hadn't even discovered planets outside of our own solar system until the mid-1990s. And it wasn't even until a few years later that we discovered that's what they were, was other planets. Now, thanks largely to the Kepler mission, we know that every star in the sky is in fact not a star. It's a solar system, that every star in the sky statistically has one or more planets around it. And we also know from that same mission that approximately 20 or even 30%, possibly even more, are rocky Earth-like planets within the so-called habitable zone of their host star, where the energy level isn't too great or too little, and would theoretically support liquid water, which we feel is a fundamental ingredient for biology as we know it. And so you do the math, and that suggests that within our own galaxy, which is one of hundreds of billions of others, there are tens of billions of potentially habitable worlds. So that's a game-changing bit of new knowledge. And one could argue that, well, for the first 25 years of the Institute's history, we didn't even know if there were other planets. We were just hoping there might be. Well, now we know there are. And I think and it seems like the more we learn, the more it is sort of statistically inevitable that there is life, and even intelligent life, beyond Earth. Another way to put it is the statistical probability that we are alone in the universe is zero. So I think that compels us to do the search, even if our techniques and technologies are somewhat primitive or somewhat limited. But we in the cosmic time scale, we haven't been at this for very long, right? 40 years in a 4 billion year old planet and a 15 billion year old universe is just nothing at all. So we have a long way to go before I think we'd be ready to hang it up and say we quit.
Now, when we, as an advanced technological civilization, engage with primitive, or how do we say this, indigenous communities that are less technologically advanced than us, we often have a non-interference policy. And, there are tribes all around the Earth where we basically leave them alone. They're incredibly remote. And it makes me think of the Prime Directive in Star Trek. Right. Captain Kirk and Spock, they have this policy that they're very strict about. And I think Gene Roddenberry, when he wrote Star Trek, I think he had some insights because he was connected to Navy intelligence. And it's very, very interesting, because is it possible, or do you think it's actually likely, that the aliens that do exist, those advanced technological civilizations out there, they know full well we're looking for them. They just don't want us to know about them just yet.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, one of the things I'm like self-trained to be in this job is open-minded, right? So I would, I don't believe in invoking absolutes like absolutely not or absolutely yes. Anything's possible. And certainly, we are as a species on our own planet sort of invoking this policy of non-interference. But we've only been doing that in modern times, right? I mean, we clearly in our past, we've had other examples of, more advanced civilizations interacting with less advanced civilizations and civilizations, and the results not going very well for the less developed populations. So it is certainly, I think, promising to see that, in modern times, we've realized that the Prime Directive, do not interfere, is really the right approach. So is it possible that there are civilizations out there that know we are here, and not so much that they don't want us to know that they're there, but rather they don't want to interfere with us, or, be disrupting our own, evolutionary processes? It's possible. I would kind of hope that, since it appears that in the course of a civilization moving from being agrarian to industrial to ultimately technological, there are unintended consequences that come along with our technology that are, in fact, in many ways, an existential threat to our own existence over, the long-term future. And in that case, I almost feel like, well, if there are more advanced civilizations who've solved those problems, and they know we're here, and they observe that we're having these problems, it'd be great if they came and helped us out. But that's maybe wishful thinking.
Now, Bill, I'm in regional New South Wales in Australia, and only a few hours away across the outback, there's a place called the Parkes Observatory that I'm sure you know well.
We do.
And I spoke to a few of the blokes there who are friends of mine, and they asked me to give you a prod because they have a nostalgia for a project that I'm sure you know well called SETI at Home.
Yes.
And it was a project, I think it ran until 2021. I think you ran out of money in the end, but it didn't get any results. But they have a beef. They've got a real issue with you lot there at SETI. They think you're Northern Hemisphere focused and they're Southern Hemisphere. And down here on the bottom of the Earth, we have a beef. You haven't been looking for life in the southern part of the hemisphere. And at one stage, it was being mooted that the Parkes Observatory might be involved in a new SETI at Home project where amateur astronomers sitting at home would be able to use software that would allow them to search for possibly artificial signals, and that the Parkes Observatory might be a focus for that. Is there any, it was being mooted a few years ago that they might restore the SETI at Home project because there is a real nostalgia for it amongst a lot of astronomers, including down here in Australia. Is there any possibility that might be resuscitated?
Sure. Well, lots of different elements to that question, starting with Parkes. So yes, we know the group at Parkes very well. We have coordinated with them on SETI observations in the past. They have been part of a consortium effort in a project called the Breakthrough Listen Initiative. And Dr. Andrew Simeon is the head of the Breakthrough Listen Initiative here in the US. He also heads SETI programs at the SETI Institute. And the Breakthrough Initiative has used some of its funding to get time on the Parkes telescope to do observations, SETI observations from the Southern Hemisphere. And the Southern Hemisphere has the advantage over the Northern Hemisphere that you can look directly at the galactic center, which is the more crowded part of the galaxy.
Yeah, we think we're superior down here, Bill. So
well, in terms of night sky and a place to look, it's absolutely correct. Now, at the same time, your listeners at south of the equator will be maybe pleased to learn that the two biggest, most capable modern radio telescope arrays are being built in the Southern Hemisphere. One in Australia, the Square Kilometre Array, and the other in South Africa, Meerkat, and they are both part of the Square Kilometre Array consortium. And we are working with both of those organizations to try and also get programs to do SETI. The newer way of doing SETI on existing instruments, instead of buying time and then having a limited opportunity to look at a certain place, is to do what's called commensal observations. And that means wherever their telescope is pointed at, which is usually going to be at some particular phenomena, capture the whole field of view and send that set of data to a different set of computers that are designed to find SETI phenomena as opposed to looking at a particular astronomical phenomena. And so we're working with different radio telescopes. We'd love to work with Parkes in that manner as well. We have a project on the Very Large Array I mentioned earlier where we are doing just that. And the amount of data we are generating is extraordinary. It's on the order of 3 terabytes per second. So it's massive. And therein lies one of the problems with SETI at Home or doing SETI now as a citizen science project. And it's in some cases like this, I'm glad to be able to say actually that the SETI at Home wasn't a SETI Institute project because I don't want anybody mad at us for no longer supporting it. But at the same time, I'm kind of sorry that it wasn't ours because it's so famous. And it's actually one of the first demonstrations of distributed computing on the history of our planet. So it's really innovative. It was done by UC Berkeley. And in fact, UC Berkeley here in California and the SETI Institute have long worked together. And we both built the Allen Telescope Array together. And Andrew is based at Berkeley. So there's lots of ties there. We are looking at, and by the way, SETI at Home didn't involve citizen science because we weren't asking people to actually do any data analytics. We were really taking advantage of their computers and letting them, there's this screensaver operate in the background to help with the computational elements. But people loved it. And I get people coming up to me from all corners of our planet, from India, from China, from Africa, and so on, saying, oh, I used to do SETI at Home. So we are looking at, SETI at Home 2.0, where this would more likely be like an app on the phone or something that you could access through your laptop or computer, which would give you access to certain data sets that might then allow you to play with them. What we have to deal with is just how large these data sets are now, where to store them, how to give people access to them. If you're talking about doing something where you want to access terabytes of data, most people's cell phones and laptops can't do that very easily. So we are working on a way to bring SETI data into the hands of citizen scientists and reimagine and relaunch SETI at Home, which we'd all love to do. So stay tuned, and maybe we can have a future conversation where we're launching that, and it'll be very exciting.
That's wonderful news, Bill. I'm sure you'll make a lot of astronomers down here very happy. Let's move on. You've got SETI, which of course is a passive system. You're listening for technosignatures from the universe. And then there's METI. There's the active SETI, messages to extraterrestrial intelligence. Where do you stand on that? Obviously, there's a huge philosophical argument in astronomy and indeed in politics. Should we be letting the aliens know we're here?
Yes. So I would say that from a logical perspective, and just a logical perspective, I might argue in support of METI proposers, in that if you want to find evidence of technological civilizations, tell them we're here, say hello, like send out a beacon. And so from a logical point of view, that's actually a very good way to try and engage some other civilization, because they would know we're here, even though it might take a long time for our message to reach a potential advanced civilization. But the counter argument for that is one that there are very strong feelings about on both sides. There are strong proponents for and very strong proponents against doing METI. And the argument against is, you might not like who you wake up or who, becomes aware of your existence, and, they might come and do us harm. And even, the renowned physicist Stephen Hawking was very much opposed to, the idea of being METI. Well, there's lots of interesting elements to this. One is that if the world's best minds and some of our greatest scientists have that concern, it also tells me that they firmly believe there's technological civilizations beyond Earth. Otherwise, they wouldn't care. So the greatest minds on our planet, I think, are all convinced that there's likely to be extraterrestrial intelligence out there somewhere. But
what's your view, though? Where do you stand?
Well, okay. So where we stand is, as an institution, and again, in particular, also getting government funding, we are not going to do something that would be viewed as highly controversial and by some as actually dangerous, just because we believe it's a logical thing to do. So our official position is we don't do METI. We are not going to do METI, and we will not do METI, until there's more of a global consensus on, hey, this actually might be an interesting thing to do. What we do want to do and intend to do, however, is to be the place where conversations of this kind happen, where we bring people together and say, well, let's talk about the merits for and the merits against, and so on. I will say that personally, I don't believe in the so-called dark forest theory that is at the heart of the don't transmit argument, because they'll come and do harm, and because that is the nature of beings. My personal feeling is, because of what I mentioned earlier about the potential existential threats we have created by virtue of our own technological developments, e.g. climate change or, harnessing the atom, et cetera, that, if there's a technological civilization that is thousands of years old, they have probably gone through the same phase in their evolution or in their existence that we're in now, i.e. they've solved the problems that were the result of their own becoming technological. They've, found energy sources that don't have the same consequences as either, nuclear or fossil fuel or things of this sort. They've solved problems of sustainability and waste management and resource consumption. And therefore, they've only been able to do that, I surmise, by being cooperative with one another. At some point, they realized we're all on this planet together. This is one island. And if we don't start cooperating together instead of killing one another, we're going to kill ourselves by virtue of our own unintentional technologies. So I feel if a civilization makes that transition to unite and to solve its problems together, and also to come up with the technologies or capabilities to address those problems, there's nothing we have that they would need. They're more likely to be benevolent than malevolent, because you can't be, I don't think, evil fundamentally and cooperate as a global civilization. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the dark forest theorem, but I respect the opinions of those who do. And I feel that, I also respect this notion of, who gets to speak for planet Earth, who should have the right and the ability to do something like transmit, and if transmitting, to be responsible for what is in that transmission. So with that in mind, we stay away from METI. We are more than happy and interested to talk about it. And again, I have my own perspectives on what I think about advanced civilizations, but it's a very interesting area.
Now, Bill, I'm going to invite you now to be hugely controversial. I want you to take a swipe at the blokes that run the James Webb Telescope, because there are a lot of people contacting me and they're pushing a conspiracy theory. James Webb now been operational for quite a while, and we're only getting one image a week, one bloody image a week. They're not releasing that much information. And I want to tell you, I've got people telling me on the inside that there is an extraordinary amount of data coming in that's not being publicly shared. Now, we all paid for the James Webb Telescope. It's been a wholehearted gesture of goodwill from the public to fund public science. Are they sharing? And on that principle, just to prod you a little bit, we know we've got hundreds of billions of dollars worth of detection systems in the military that are funded, and you've got NASA doing the similar thing, including with James Webb. Are they sharing with you? And do you think they tell you? I mean, you're a not-for-profit, very wholeheartedly generous organization that's run on the smell of an oily rag and full of goodwill to do the right thing. Are you at all confident that you're being shared the information that ought properly to be being shared in the interests of public science?
Sure. Well, a couple of things about James Webb is that one of its missions is observational astronomy, so to take pictures, to take images, and then to share those image data sets with the scientific public. However, another part of its mission, and this is the reason why the mirrors are not silver, but they're gold, as you'll note, and your audience will note. And that is because they're optimized for the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So gold mirrors will reflect infrared wavelength light more efficiently than silver. And the reason that infrared is interesting is because one of the capabilities of James Webb is to do what we call molecular spectroscopy on exoplanet atmospheres. So for planets which are sufficiently close, within a couple dozen light years, the James Webb Telescope can actually look through their atmospheres, with the starlight from the host star, shining through those atmospheres, and then looking with infrared detectors on the James Webb Telescope at these infrared wavelengths, and where so-called absorption peaks happen, or where light gets absorbed at certain wavelengths, that tells us what the composition of those atmospheres are. Does the atmosphere have water and hydrogen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, things like that? And so one of the reasons we're not just getting a stream of image data is because there's these other data sets from James Webb, and there have already been papers published using those data, suggesting the possibility of biology on certain planets because of what's been discovered in the atmospheres. These atmospheric, say, so-called fingerprints of what might be life, we call biosignatures. So we would say that, this particular composition of an atmosphere would be difficult to explain without the presence of some life form on the planet's surface. And, there have been some very interesting discoveries that have been, written up in the scientific literature, suggesting the possibility that, some of these may be a result of life. So I know that a lot of data is getting generated. We have people on James Webb. So based on your provocative question, I will seek their counsel on what is the issue with image data sets from James Webb and how frequently they're being distributed. All of NASA data is open source. That's the policy. The military is, of course, different, and they're not under any obligation to share anything with any of us, least of all the SETI Institute. But NASA is, to your point, it's a taxpayer-funded, public entity, and it serves the scientific community. Now, there are times when telescopes are used by scientists to perform certain experiments because the scientist has a certain theory or area of research they're working on. And in some cases, because the scientist has secured time on the telescope, the data associated with their observations is not made public until the scientist has the opportunity to take it, look at it, understand whether there's something new here, publish a paper. And, so you get this so-called embargo period sometimes where the data that's informing certain kinds of research has a delay before it gets shared with the public because, a scientist wants to be able to see, is this supporting my theory, or can I use this in my research? Is there a new and exciting discovery or paper here to be written? So I can't either confirm nor deny this notion that there's only one image a week. I find that somewhat hard to believe, but I will confirm with my team here and check that out. But those would be the issues that might limit what people are seeing in the short term coming from the telescope.
It does beg the question, though, Bill. You mentioned the military does have phenomenal optical technology, and a lot of it's looking out towards space. I didn't realize this until I spoke to friends of mine who've actually seen what's going on at Pine Gap here in Australia, where we do have a lot of ballistic warning, looking for ICBMs being operated by the Chinese, the Russians, or the North Koreans to look for imminent launches. But apparently we've also got satellites looking out into space, and those military satellites are highly classified. Do they ever share with an organization like you? Is there any kind of cross-pollination where somebody from the military comes and says, oh, do you guys want to have a look at this? It's quite interesting. Or really, is there that level of secrecy? Do you think they would ever tell you if they found evidence of an extraterrestrial civilization?
Yeah, so it is interesting with military assets that are used for observations in our own airspace, or pointing up or pointing down. That I think there are situations where they would like to share data or information. We've had certain conversations along those lines, but in many cases, the hesitation to share information is not because what the information contains at all, but rather we don't want this organization or that organization or these people in a different country to know our capabilities. They don't want to know the capabilities of these instruments and how sensitive they are, how capable they are, and if we share this data, even though it's not data that's interesting to us or has anything to do with national security, someone will say, "Oh my God, look at the capability of this instrument." So that's usually the issue, I think, around more of the let's say intelligence or military-based assets of this kind is, they don't want to share information, even if it's scientifically interesting, in concerns over, inadvertently sharing information about the technology behind those data.
Now, Bill, you implied at the very beginning of our conversation that you had other projects that you wanted to tell us about. Is there some new issue that SETI's up to that we should know about?
Well, we do have, I mentioned the COSMIC project on the Very Large Array. That is really extraordinary. I mentioned that as being perhaps the most comprehensive SETI endeavor ever undertaken so far, because it is using certainly the most powerful or sensitive and capable radio telescope on the northern hemisphere. The new arrays in the southern hemisphere will at some point be more capable than the VLA. But NRAO hopes to build the next generation VLA, so we'll come back to that in the future. But it's also using an extraordinarily sensitive instrument with a wider frequency range than anything else we've ever deployed for SETI purposes, and it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's generating. We're able to process massive amounts of data because of modern compute technologies and so on. So where's
the receiver for this, Bill?
This is the very large array. So this is the big telescopes in New Mexico, and the data processing for it is on site. So essentially, we went in with NRAO and we built new backends to those telescopes. Each telescope now has 2 optical fibers coming off the back of this 27 dish array. One set of fibers goes to the computers of NRAO, and the other set comes to our computers. They're capturing the information about a phenomena that they're looking at, usually some point in the sky. We're capturing the entire field of view. So imagine looking through binoculars at a hummingbird, but processing all the information around that hummingbird in high resolution and all the time. And that's what we're doing. So it's generating, as I mentioned, they're like 3 terabytes of data per second. And so it's a huge new SETI project. And we hope to replicate that kind of commensal observation on these new radio telescopes in the southern hemisphere and elsewhere. We're also involved in conversations about putting a radio telescope on the far side of the moon. And
Wow.
the reason for that is because that would be a radio quiet area. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest problem we have as radio astronomers looking for faint radio signals from beyond our solar system is all the radio signals not within our own Earth's orbit and atmosphere and immediate surroundings. I mean, we're surrounded by microwave ovens, garage door openers, cell phones, cell towers, radio, TV, etc. So it's an extraordinarily noisy environment. And so you put radio telescopes in remote locations for the same reason you put optical telescopes on high mountains, to get rid of the things that make observations difficult. In our case, it's radio interference. For optical instruments, it's light and atmospheric density. So that's an interesting project is these commensal observations. But the interesting project of putting a telescope on the backside of the moon gets around this problem of radio interference. And so that's a very serious discussion we're now having. How much would it cost? Launch capability now is much more affordable than it used to be. Building, designing, and deploying a dish that you could put on the far side and have it self-deploy and open up. And, all of these kinds of technologies are within our grasp. Becomes a budgetary issue. So that's very exciting. And then we have an optical SETI program called Laser SETI, where we have built these special cameras with 2 lenses for each camera system and putting multiple camera systems on sites around the world to do what we call all sky, all the time observations, looking for, laser pulses or optical phenomena that are engineered versus natural. And, that's, again, a very comprehensive project, given that it's global. All sky, all the time is the ultimate objective there. We have 3 observatories. We'll cover most of the sky once we have 6, but the ultimate idea is to have as many as 12 different places around the world deploying that technology, which could be very interesting.
Wrapping up, Bill, you've been in the job now for a year or 2. Is there going to come a day soon, you think, when you're going to be able to put out a press release and say, we think we've found it? Give me some hope, sir.
Yes. Well, so 2 parallel efforts are ongoing. One, of course, is looking for even the most basic signs of life within our own solar system. We are part of those endeavors. And I think, quite honestly, that within the next 10 or 15 years, we may actually be in a position where we're saying, yes, there's other life, even in our own solar system. We can't have a conversation with it. It's not advanced life necessarily. It could be intelligent life, maybe under the frozen surface of Enceladus or Europa. I do think that, finding evidence of life, even within our own solar system, is within our grasp in a fairly short period of time. And it will be extraordinarily profound as well, because especially if that life has a unique biogenesis. In other words, if it has nothing to do, it emerged on its own, and with nothing to do with the emergence of life on Earth. The implications of that would be, okay, it's like game over. Life is going to be found everywhere. I have a quote, which someday I hope to be attributed to me, which is, the most remarkable thing we may discover about life is that it's not remarkable at all. Not that it isn't interesting, but it isn't, that it's everywhere, and it happens at every possible opportunity. So that, I think, is imminent. In terms of the discovery of intelligent technological life, this is a tough one, because we could make an announcement next week. We could make an announcement next year. It could be 10 years. It could be 20. But I do think, because we are deploying more advanced technologies and more sensitive technologies, we're able to do things faster and more cleverly than ever before. Yes, it could be soon. One maybe quick word about artificial intelligence and how that's allowing us to change the way we look for SETI signals. So if we're looking for a narrowband radio frequency signal, which has been the traditional thing we've been looking for in SETI, then we are looking for a very specific phenomena, and we're ignoring anything else, right? And therefore we're confining our search to something, very specific. And ET could be doing something completely different. Now, here's another approach. Take those same radio telescopes and train an AI to understand the radio background environment in its entirety all the time, and find anything different, anything unusual or anomalous. That's a much more comprehensive technique, because it might find something weird that's wideband and not narrowband, or,
So we're not doing that at the moment.
We are now starting to use AI tools to do SETI observations exactly in that manner. In other words, don't look for a particular phenomena, rather computationally and mathematically and from an AI perspective, understand, the background reality, and then tell me anything you see that's different. And that's a very, very powerful new capability.
So, Bill Diamond, you've just given me a glorious reason for optimism that someday soon you're going to step up to a lectern, and even though those dastardly Drumfields or whoever they are in the White House are trying to stop you, you strike me as a decent bloke. You're going to reveal all and tell us the truth about the ETs out there. And there's reason for optimism, because with modern AI, we're going to find things we previously didn't even think possible. Absolutely. So, sir, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this time with us. And I wish you the very, very best with SETI in the future.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's been a great pleasure.
Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart. And today we're delving into the mystery of 9/11. Now, I was a reporter covering the tragedy, the attack on the incredible attacks on America in 2001. And it's a shock to me today, as it was back then, the way in which this incredibly well-planned attack happened under the radar of the most powerful country in the world and the most well-informed intelligence agencies working for that country. It was an appalling intelligence failure, catastrophic intelligence failure. And the thing that leapt out to me as a reporter in the days following the attacks was, why were so many Saudis, including Saudis who were linked to the House of Saud, families with close connections to the royal family in Saudi Arabia, why were they, when there was a no-fly zone over the United States, allowed to discreetly leave the United States, including, incredibly, as we discovered in the days following, about 24 members of the bin Laden family, no less. And I spoke at the time to an FBI investigator who told me that he, for the life of him, couldn't understand why, if these people were being allowed to leave America, why weren't statements being taken off them? What was the explanation for that? And a lot of those questions remain unanswered. And of course, 3,000 plus people died in that tragedy. And our guest today is one of those people who lost loved ones. Terry Strada, you represent an organisation that is taking a lawsuit against the Saudi government and I think also members of the bin Laden family. Maybe if you could just please introduce yourself to Reality Check. And I want to explore with you today what's going on behind the scenes, the mysteries, the questions that are still unanswered about 9/11.
Yes, thank you very much for having me today. My name is Terry Strada, and I am the National Chair for the 9/11 Families United. This organization consists of over 10,000 victims' family members, injured survivors, and those who are sick and dying from their exposure to the toxic fumes at Ground Zero. We are suing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the role that it played in aiding and abetting the 19 hijackers that came here and murdered our loved ones.
So that's a big call. Obviously, I don't doubt for a moment that bin Laden and his family, I know that members of the bin Laden family were funding, perhaps inadvertently, let's give them that excuse, through the Al Haramain charity. I know that money was going from very wealthy people in Saudi Arabia, including members of the bin Laden family, directly to some of the 9/11 hijackers. But
Yes.
in the 9/11 Commission report, there was very much a spin that came through that report that such connections, such charitable payments were inadvertent, that they weren't intended. And there was the idea pushed by the 9/11 report. I mean, this is the definitive investigation into the 9/11 investigation. We were told that, quote, it does not appear that any government other than the Taliban financially supported al-Qaeda before 9/11, although some governments may have contained al-Qaeda sympathizers who turned a blind eye to al-Qaeda's fundraising activity. And it went on to say Saudi Arabia has long been considered the primary source of al-Qaeda funding, but we have found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded the organization. And they said in brackets, this conclusion does not exclude the likelihood that charities with significant Saudi government sponsorship diverted funds to al-Qaeda. Now, Terry, that's the definitive finding from the 9/11 Commission, which was obviously quite a few years ago. What do we know now?
We know so much more now than we did when the 9/11 Commission was published. The FBI withheld a lot of evidence that they were mandated to hand over to the 9/11 Commission. They withheld it from them. They've withheld it from the 9/11 family's lawsuit, but we have been able to uncover quite a lot of new evidence. But if you don't mind, I'd like to put the lawsuit into perspective and that you have to go back to the 1990s leading up to 2001 and remember that the kingdom was exporting extremism all around the world. They were sending their religious clerics and operatives into their mosques, and they were spreading the virulent Wahhabi form of Islam. The United States was not immune to this activity. Mohammed bin Salman himself, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he acknowledges that his government partook in this type of activity. And now we know from US intelligence reports that some of these operatives, and they were working out of the Saudi Arabian embassy in Washington, D.C. They were working in a program called the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, MOIA. And some of these individuals we now know were directly assisting the 9/11 hijackers. When we took this to court, I'll just finish and you can use it however you want. But when we took this evidence and laid it out in front of a judge, put it out on the table, and we had FBI reports, affidavits, U.S. investigative reports, and we laid it all out, and we challenged the kingdom to prove that these individuals were not Saudi government officials. The Saudi Arabian government was unwilling to do that and unable to do that. And that is why the judge ruled that our lawsuit could move forward.
Because previously there was a sovereign immunity, you couldn't sue a government. And what's the law that was passed in the Congress that allowed this lawsuit to happen? Can you explain that to our audience?
Yes, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. It's called JASTM. That's the acronym for it. And that is a law that was enacted in 2016. It took 7 years to enact this piece of legislation that allows U.S. citizens that are harmed by a designated terrorist organization that commits a terrorist attack on U.S. soil, that we can hold the sponsors of that attack responsible in a court of law, in a U.S. court in civil litigation. And the purpose for that is fulsome liability, to enable the victims' families, the injured survivors, to have some type of accountability. And that lawsuit, or that, I'm sorry, that law, what enabled us to continue our lawsuit in the courtrooms, because yes, they were being granted sovereign immunity, which nobody is entitled to if they're involved in a terrorist attack.
So, Terry, before we go any further, I'm going to ask you about what happened to your loved one. Let's talk about your own personal experience with 9/11 very briefly.
Okay. Yeah, so I lost my husband, Tom. He was 41 years old. He worked for Counter Fitzgerald. He was on the 104th floor of the North Tower. On that Tuesday morning, he got up to go to work, and I stayed home with our three children. Tommy was 7, Caitlin was 4, and the baby was 4 days old, Justin. Tom was only going to go to work for half a day and come back early because we had the newborn in the house. Shortly after the first plane hit the North Tower, my phone rang and Tom was on the other end, and it was horrible. He was frantically telling me what was happening, and I could hear the screams and the fear. We had over 25 friends that he worked with on his desk, every single person, because nobody made it out of Canada that day. So with that phone call, I call it a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing for him to reach me, but it's been a curse I've had to live with, hearing that and being, kind of brought right into the horror of all of it.
And you've dedicated pretty much your entire life since to getting to the truth of why that attack was allowed to happen.
Yes, I have. I started in 2002 when I stood on a stage in Washington, D.C. with some of the bravest 9/11 families I know, and we announced our lawsuit. Back then, my organization was called 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism. And the mission hasn't changed. We've wanted to expose the underbelly of terrorism, the financiers, and we believe if we can hold them accountable and punish them, that we can stem the flow of money that supports these terrorist organizations. And I believe if the US government, my own government, had taken a stronger stance on terrorism financing after 9/11, we might not see the growth of Boko Haram, Hamas, Hezbollah. We wouldn't have empowered other countries. You can finance terrorism because even the United States doesn't hold you accountable. But the
So,
families.
Terry, I had my own personal experience with Wahhabist Islam, funded by the Saudi Arabians. I covered the Bali bombing attack, and I saw things I never ever want to see again: burned bodies and people who subsequently died who were suffering terrible burns in hospital in Bali. I was sent over there by my Australian network in the very early days. And then we went to Solo in Java, where we confronted Abu Bakr Bashir, who was the Jama'ah Islamiyah boss of the Jama'ah Islamiyah terror group. And the thing that shocked me was how a lot of the people involved in the Bali bombing were middle-class kids whose Jakarta-based parents had looked for a cheap private school education offered by the Wahhabist madrasas funded by the Saudi government across Indonesia. And what shocked me was that there were people from your country's CIA in the American embassy who were telling me how this was the real cancer that was radicalizing young youth right across Southeast Asia. And one of the problems that we have in Australia, we have beautiful Muslim communities, but there are a fringe of extremist young people and elderly Wahhabist clerics who have a malign influence on the people in these communities because of
Mhm.
essentially a strand of Islam,
Yes.
extremist, zealous strand of Islam that was funded directly by the Saudi government as a
Yes.
way of propping up Saudi influence. And you're saying that this is very much the same kind of cancer that's behind what you've uncovered in your investigations?
Yes, absolutely. It is the kingdom spreading of extremism around the world. That was their second export to oil in the 90s. They don't deny it. Everybody, our government acknowledges it, and so does MBS. That
Okay,
that
but can I come then to the quick?
Mhm,
Um, I want to take you through the evidence that we know about
mhm,
at the moment in the
mhm,
lawsuit, because I think one of the difficulties you have as a campaigner is that you're probably aware of some of the redacted material that at the moment is not public information.
right.
But, and I'm a little bit aware of some of that material that points to more alleged complicity of senior Saudi government
Mhm,
officials. The
mhm,
question in my mind is, yes, you had a lot of extremist Wahhabist supporters inside the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in Saudi Arabia. And the line that was pushed by the 9/11 report was that because the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, they don't really govern. They
mm.
let the governing be done for them. They were unwittingly exploited by these extremist Wahhabists inside the government, that they weren't aware of these people doing these terrible things, funding through known charities these terror groups. Let's go through the evidence that you have at the moment for your lawsuit that's public, including the video that came out most recently. And then let's talk about what might be behind the redacted material that you're still pushing to get put out into the public domain.
Right. So 10 days after September 11th, the Metropolitan Police in London raided Omar al-Bayoumy's apartment. And he was, at that time, a person of interest because his name was on the lease for the two hijackers that crashed into the Pentagon, Hazmi and Madar, the first arriving hijackers. When they seized this evidence out of his apartment, it was a treasure trove of evidence. And they sent it to the FBI. It contained videos, it contained his phone book, it contained a drawing a plane trajectory, which we can talk about. And when the FBI received it, they did absolutely nothing with it. They actually buried it for at least 10 years.
Now, why did that happen? I mean, I've got friends in the FBI. I know people in the counterterrorism groups in the FBI. They were dedicated people who really wanted to nail the bad guys that were responsible for 9/11. What went wrong, Terry?
There's absolutely wonderful people in the FBI that dedicated their lives to investigating what happened. But there were people within the FBI that did not want the truth to come out, and they have bent over backwards to protect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's self preservation. At that level, those people never wanted to take any responsibility for their failures. But that isn't why 9/11, it's part of why 9/11 happened, but it's because of the kingdom putting their government employees into the Saudi Arabian embassy. And it was because of their extremist beliefs that they then supported the 19 hijackers, and they created the support network that was needed here in the United States in order for them to carry out the attacks. Everything they needed, from their housing, their car rentals, their plane lessons, their airplane tickets to practice run. So for 12 to 18 months, the hijackers were here, and there was a support network that was put in place by Saudi government officials, by government people on the Saudi government um, payroll that are
So
responsible.
let's just quickly talk about al-Bayoumi. Omar al-Bayoumi, what was his connection to the Saudi government?
In 2017, the FBI confirmed that he was a Saudi intelligence officer. He was not just a Saudi national here on a student visa working for a company that he never showed up to, but was collecting a paycheck. And when the first arriving hijackers got here out in California, where al Bayoumi was, his salary tripled. He was a Saudi intelligence operative.
Now, one of the things you just mentioned in the raid that was done by Scotland Yard in London, in the apartment in North London where Al Bayoumi was living at the time, there was a document found that appeared to be some kind of document planning the rate of descent necessary for an aircraft to reach a particular altitude and particular location. Can you explain to me what we know about that document?
Yes, it's called the plane drawing. And when Bayumi was deposed, he admitted it was his handwriting. So we know it belonged to Al Bayumi. And what it is, as you just said, it's a trajectory and it's calculations of if you didn't have instruments, how would you land the plane? And it shows if you put the calculations in, and experts have done this, it shows the rate of descent needed to hit a target on the ground. I think one of the calculations also, when they did the mathematical equations, showed the descent to hit the Twin Towers. So there's a drawing of an airplane, there's the mathematical calculations, and when you do the calculations as an expert, as a pilot does, I think we used a pilot that had 7 decades of experience in military and commercial aviation. And they have concluded that no doubt this was part of the 9/11 attacks.
Now, one of the things that uh, there was a Senate Select Committee for Intelligence report that was done because I think of a lot of the good work done by yourself, raising public awareness of the fact that there were unanswered questions, that there was clearly redacted material that was being withheld by the US government.
Yes.
And I think from memory, there was a Florida Democratic senator called Bob Graham, who was the
Mhm.
chair, like he was the most powerful person on the Senate Intelligence
Yes.
Committee at the time. And he said in his sworn statements after their report came out that there was evidence of support from the Saudi government
Mhm.
for the terrorists. And incredibly, my understanding is there were and still are 28 redacted pages from that report that the public still haven't been allowed to see in their entirety.
In 2016, the 28 pages were released, but they, of the 20, if you were to add up all of the redactions, it adds up to about 3 pages worth of information, which was critical that they decided to withhold. But what was so
That,
astonishing?
that was my point, is that even though they've supposedly released these redacted
Yeah,
pages, that they're still redacted and
um,
and they're
nothing's ever
still
released in its entirety.
so
Nothing.
they're still
Everything
they're
is
still hiding.
redacted, and
So
some
they're
things
still hiding stuff. So
are absolutely.
what
But
do
can I
you
tell you
think?
what we learned in those 28 pages? What we did learn?
Yes.
We did learn that money was going through Prince Bandar. So he was the ambassador, the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States. And money was going through his account as well as his wife's bank account out to California to these handlers, Bayumi and Thumari. And some money was being transferred, like I said, through their bank accounts out to them in California. So we knew that money was funding from the embassy. What I take away from the 28 pages is the 2 things that we learned was, one, that the Saudis are undeniably complicit in September 11th, and that the Saudis were also never fully investigated. That
Okay,
report came out before the 9/11 Commission.
let's drill down into that, because again, there was a brief mention, I think in the 9/11 report or in one of the later reports, that it was Prince Bandar's wife who donated money to the Al Haramain charity, which,
Mhm.
funnily enough, is the charity that was funding a lot of the madrasas I was talking about,
Yes.
the religious teaching institutions in Indonesia that I came across, which were helping fund the Wahhabist extremists in Indonesia. Now, the spin that has been put on this is that, yes, these were inadvertent fundings done by, I think, Prince Bandar's wife, that it's part of, I think they call it zakat, and please forgive me, any Muslim friends, if I've mispronounced that, but essentially there is a duty in Islam to support those less well off than yourself. And the argument was that this was an inadvertent funding, it wasn't intentional, and that money channeled through these charities was being given for noble purposes, not specifically and intentionally for terrorism. What evidence do we have to suggest that there was knowledge at the highest levels of the Saudi government that this money was being directed to support an act of terrorism on the American public?
Bank records. Bank records show deposits and bank records show withdrawals, and they show who made these deposits and who was withdrawing the money. So the bank records support that the money was going to terrorist organizations.
But sorry, my understanding is it was the money from Prince Bandar's wife, for example, that you talked about. My understanding is it went to an Islamic charity, and that the excuse that's being used is that she's a good woman, she's got a lot of money. I think there was $36 million talked about, and that this money was being diverted just for good, noble purposes as a good Islam woman to basically support people less well off than herself. What's the evidence that Prince Bandar, his wife, or senior Saudi government officials actually knew that they were supporting a terrorist attack on America? Because that's the implication of what you're saying.
It is. It's because they were sending money out to the handlers in California that were handling the hijackers. They didn't just give money to charity, they also wrote checks and sent money directly to the handlers of the 9/11 hijackers.
So these were, I think one of them was al-Bayoumi that you've mentioned, Omar al-Bayoumi. And who was this Fahad al-Thumari? He was a Saudi government employee
Yeah,
working in the LA consulate, but he was
yes,
also linked to the King Fahd Mosque in
mosque.
Los
Correct,
Angeles.
correct. And that
And
is, and so, right. So Thumari was tasked by some of the employees back at Moya in Washington, D.C., to assist the hijackers when they came to the United States. And so was Bayoumi. So originally, their story was that Bayoumi just met these two hijackers in a cafe by accident. He heard them speaking Arabic, so he befriended them. But what did he do? He took them to a bank, Bank of America, and he opened up a bank account for them. They gave him $9,999 in cash to open up this bank account. And then he went and signed a lease for their apartment so that they were very close to where he lived. And then he tried to tell, the police, or when he was arrested, his story was, I was just being a good Saudi Arabian citizen. It's what we do. We help people out when we meet them. But do you really go to the extent of opening up bank accounts and putting your name on a lease? And then the story just unfolds and it gets so much bigger, and the net gets so much bigger about who was actually involved in tasking Bayoumi, in tasking Thumari, and the evidence that came out of Bayoumi's apartment tells the whole story.
okay, so let's deal with this now. The 9/11 report, I'm just using the 9/11 report as a template because I think it's instructive. It's what the American people were told, the government determined in what was meant to be a transparent and open and full and rigorous inquiry into 9/11, okay?
Yes.
So this is what the 9/11 report said about what happened with these two terrorists, Hazmi and Midhar, in their first few weeks in the States. So we have investigated whether anyone associated with the King Fahd Mosque assisted them. This subject has received substantial attention in the media. Some have speculated that Fahad al-Thumari, an imam at the mosque and an accredited diplomat at the Saudi Arabian consulate from 96 until 2003, may have played a role in helping the hijackers establish themselves on their arrival in Los Angeles. This speculation is based, at least in part, on Thumari's reported leadership of an extremist faction at the mosque.
Correct.
Now, I know you've got an answer for this, but I'll just finish. The definitive conclusion from 9/11 was the circumstantial evidence makes Thumari a logical person to consider as a possible contact for Hazmi and Midhar. Quote, yet, after exploring the available leads, we have not found evidence that Thumari provided assistance to the two operatives. Now, I'll tell you, Terry, I'll say what I think that is. That is bullshit. That is a total lie. They knew at the time, didn't they, about Fahad al-Thumari's funding to these two Al-Qaeda operatives, didn't they?
Well, what the 9/11 Commission knew exactly, I don't know. I can't answer. I can't speak on that. All I know is what they claimed in their final report, and what we know now is two very different things.
We're partnering with Gundry MD to share this information with you. Would you believe it if I told you that in many pantries across the United States right now, there are bottles of a substance that is one of the healthiest foods on the planet? Yep, it's true, and it's not one of those trendy superfoods that costs you a squillion. Spoiler alert, it's olive oil. But not only does it taste good, it makes you feel exceptionally healthy on the inside. And if you accept Dr. Stephen Gundry's research, it also makes you look youthful on the outside. The olive oil industry is huge, and you can tell by the number of olive oil brands you see at the grocery store, and you can bet not all of them are made with the consumer in mind. Many brands cut corners. And so Stephen Gundry has done the research. When he came to this realization about olive oil, he was appalled that some of the olive oils were frankly not that good. But some olive oils, he's discovered, are so powerful it may take only a few teaspoons or tablespoons a week to see these incredible health benefits. So how can you tell between an olive oil that can be a health booster and which one isn't up to par? In an effort to answer that question, Dr. Gundry did his research, and he's taken a stand, and he's releasing his personal research for you to review and make your own judgment on. People who have taken Dr. Gundry's advice have shared their results with him, saying the olive oil they bought after learning his simple rules has changed their lives. So make sure you go to getolive1.com/Ross or click on the link in the description box below. What is it that we know now, Terry, that's been hidden by the US government that they almost certainly knew at the time of the 9/11 Commission report? What is being concealed from the American public about this incredible period in American history? What don't we know? Please tell us.
This is the 9/11 Commission did not know about this evidence. The FBI did not hand over this evidence to the 9/11 Commission. Therefore, their findings are very different than the truth. So there was also a secret investigation into the kingdom that went on for 10 years post 9/11 called Operation Encore. And that was the FBI doing a very, very thorough job of investigating the attacks. However, that's been released. It's heavily redacted. Our representatives can see a lot more of it than we can, and we are still fighting in court to get it lifted from a protective order in the courtroom. So there's still a lot that's being hidden from us. But okay, so now what do we know? Because of the evidence that was found in Bayumi's apartment, we know that Thumari and Bayumi were much closer in relations to the hijackers and they were involved with Al-Qaeda operatives. They were involved with other diplomats that came from the embassy. But the Al-Qaeda operatives, two of them, they're part of the advanced team that Moya sent out to California. And both of them are Al-Qaeda operatives or have very close ties to Al-Qaeda. And those men helped task Bayumi and Thumari with what needed to be done in this support network to help these hijackers. There was a welcome party where you see Thumari and Bayumi with the hijackers in a very casual setting. So to tell the FBI or to deny that they knew each other or that they knew them as well as they did has been proven to be wrong. And there's phone records now between everybody. And the phone records don't lie, that they were actually speaking to each other and calling the embassy in Washington, D.C. during this time that the hijackers were just first in the United States and setting up the support network. So those first two advanced team, after they left California, they went to Oklahoma and Missouri. Those are the two places where Hazmi and Madar went after they left California. And the story continues that wherever that those two people went, then those two hijackers followed. So they were setting up what was needed in whatever town they were going to next. Remember, they were here for 12 to 18 months.
What's the most damning piece of evidence that you've seen where Thumari and Bayoumi clearly went beyond just showing Islamic hospitality to these new people who'd arrived in America?
I would say the welcome party, the welcome video that clearly shows that Madar and Hazmi were guests of honor instead of the narrative that they tell is that they were sitting in a back room and they really weren't involved with the people that were there, because when the video camera scans the room is when you learn how many Saudi government officials were in the room.
And what's the evidence, though, that any of those Saudi government officials had any knowledge that these two men were terrorists, hijackers, planning an
The
attack on?
evidence, through the reporting and through the evidence, it shows which jobs they were tasked with. So different ones were tasked to help them with their flying lessons. Different ones were tasked to help them with their bank accounts. Different ones were with their buying a car, their English lessons. All of these individuals that were at this welcome party had jobs to do to help the hijackers.
So just help me here for a moment, Terry. I mean, I still wrestle with this, and I know the answer, but I want you to explain it to our audience. Why on earth would people working for the Saudi Ministry of Islamic Affairs want to launch an attack in any way, sponsor an attack on America, which, after all, is one of Saudi Arabia's biggest customers for its oil and is notionally a close friend of America? What on earth would be the motivation of these people for launching such an attack? And is it possible that these people who were working, I think, through the auspices of the the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in Saudi Arabia, is it possible that they were just a bunch of hotheads who were doing this without the knowledge of the higher ups in the royal family, people like Prince Bandar?
Well, again, there was money going from Prince Bandar's bank account to assist them. And it was Prince Bandar that went to President Bush and asked him to please get them all out of the country. And he didn't want any of them to be questioned. When an Al Qaeda operative was arrested and they confiscated his phone book, he had the very private phone number of Prince Bandar's residence in Colorado that nobody had. So,
But why? Why would anybody in the Saudi government? I mean, I wrestle with this still. What was going on? Why would the Saudi government, either officially or unofficially, even if it was compromised by a few people from within, why would those people want to launch an attack on America?
because these were jihadists. These were jihadists with extremist ideology that, wanted to attack and kill Americans. And they found a way to do it, to just come under the radar into the United States, go to the Saudi embassy. Moya, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, was filled with extremists and like-minded Al-Qaeda operatives. And some had diplomatic credentials that were falsified so that the United States government wouldn't be watching closely what they were doing and what they were up to. So it's a branch of the Saudi government, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and it is government officials on the Saudi payroll that created the support network that was needed to carry out the attacks. Their motivation, Osama bin Laden, let everybody know when he issued a fatwa years before that he was going to attack the United States on US soil. It was Al-Qaeda that hated the Americans that wanted to do this. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was filled with extremists that had Al-Qaeda operatives. So Al-Qaeda is a very well-organized terrorist organization. And they knew the only way they could carry out the attacks is if they had a support network set up in the United States that was, like you said, going kind of under the radar. And for whatever reason, back then, Saudis were not under suspicion. And even though our FBI, there was an FBI agent in Minnesota or Michigan, that called the New York FBI offices to tell them that, these Muslim nationalists or these Saudi nationalists were taking flying lessons, and they only wanted to learn how to fly, to take off. They didn't want to learn how to land, and she was very concerned about that. Well, that got ignored. The Phoenix, Arizona memo, trying to alert the FBI again that these extremists or these people were trying to fly planes and not land them. There were so many warnings that got ignored, and yes, it was an intelligence failure. But when you ask me, why did Saudi Arabia want to attack us? It's because they were filled with radical Islamist terrorists and jihadists, and they were spreading it around the world. They were building their mosques and filling their mosques with these radical clerics, and they were radicalizing people, and it was just a very, very poisonous, venomous program. And it happened. I don't know why or how, but it did.
You've talked about the welcome video, which was the video of the party where al-Bayoumi and Fahad al-Famari hosted the two hijackers, the two terrorists. But there's also another video, which I personally find the most damning. And that's a video that was allegedly shot by al-Bayoumi in 1999.
Yeah.
And can you explain what that video shows? And for me, the most chilling point in that video is where al-Bayoumi refers to the plan.
Yes. Yes. So, as part of the evidence that was seized in London, there was a casing of the U.S. Capitol that Bayoumi is in, right? So, there's somebody filming Bayoumi while he is in Washington, D.C., and he talks of the plan. And they are carefully going over the entrances, the security posts. They go inside the Capitol. He says greetings, to my esteemed brothers. And he talks about going over to the Washington Monument, and he'll get back to them when he gets over there. He talks about, he sees some workers on a scaffolding, and he goes up and he's looking at it, and he talks about the demons. He said that we, the Americans, call our children the demons. He said they are the demons. It's a very eerie, shocking video to watch in its entirety. You do see and learn, and experts have confirmed. This video was filmed in the 90-day period that Al-Qaeda was choosing its targets in the United States. And the Capitol was one that they were all in agreement that they wanted to use on as part of their planning.
In fact, as I understand it, Flight 93 that was brought down in Pennsylvania, it's speculated that it was Flight 93, which was heroically brought down by passengers that fought the terrorists. It was intended to hit the Capitol. And I think on that video, I'll just talk to what the video shows. There's a moment where al-Bayoumi is filming what looks like the X-ray machines, or the machines that scan for weapons as you go into the Capitol building. And he actually says, "You said that in the plan." That's a clear admission that there's some kind of sinister reason for why he's showing the security checkpoints at the Congress, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And also in the video, when he does get over to the Washington Monument and he scans over to the Smithsonian, and he scans over to the Smithsonian. And if you're looking at an aerial shot between the monument and the Smithsonian, it creates a clear runway to the Capitol.
Now, the thing that really shocks me, Terry, is that video came into the possession of the American authorities within days of the 9/11 attack. They've had that video since they raided al-Bayoumi's apartment in 2001. So 23 years ago, they got that video, nearly a quarter of a century ago, and it's only just come out now.
Yes, and it didn't come out because the FBI ever cooperated or wanted it to come out. It came out because our representatives, the 9/11 families, went to London and asked them if we could have it. And they released it to our representatives without a protective order, which meant the public could see it. But then the courts put a protective order on it immediately. And it took months to unravel that decision. And finally, because did not belong to the FBI and it did not belong to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, because both of those things are under protective order, the judge had to release the protective order and say, this can now go out into the public domain. And yes, so then experts took it and they've translated it into English, and that's why you can see it now. It's on my website. You can see this video, and it is very disturbing and very, very upsetting, not just to see it, but like you said, to know they had it that many years ago.
So just help me here. I'm a bear with a very small brain. I want you to state the bleeding obvious, Terry. Why on earth would officials in the FBI, the American government, perhaps the White House, why would they want to suppress a video which at the very least reflects very poorly on the motivations and the sinister implications behind why a Saudi diplomat, a spy, was filming the Congress in that 90-day period before Osama bin Laden was selecting targets for the attacks that he was planning on America? Why would your government, why would the American government want to hide something like that?
The answers that I've been told are in the beginning when it came over to the FBI that they were understaffed and they were working so hard, worried about another attack, because this is, 10 days to 2 weeks after the attacks. It was in Arabic. This is what I've been told. They didn't have enough translators. And it just looked like, because it's listed as home movies, home videos, that's what Bayumi wrote on the videos. It looked like home movies. There was a phone book in Arabic. And this is what they tell us. I'm not saying I believe it 100% at all, but that it just didn't seem that important. And it sat around for 10 years in a warehouse, I believe, and was never supposed to be seen by the
Do you
Americans.
believe that, Terry? I don't believe that for a moment. I think any sensible, seasoned police investigator looking at that video would reach the conclusion that at the very least, it provides circumstantial evidence of some kind of a sinister plot. Why would a Saudi intelligence official be filming the Congress's security checkpoints, security officials, even the black cars that they use for escorting politicians? And why would he be saying, you said that in the plan? It's
Yes.
more than just a tourist video, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But remember, Bayumi was not known as a Saudi intelligence operative post 9/11. It wasn't until 2017 that we now can see the FBI reports confirming that he is a Saudi intelligence officer. So their story is that they didn't even look at these videos because Bayumi wasn't known as to anybody, and that they just saw home videos on them, and so everything was in Arabic. The first guy that popped it into a machine couldn't understand what it was. So this is their story, and that it just got put aside for at least 10 years.
So clearly, America buys an enormous amount of oil from Saudi Arabia. And it's quite obvious that at one stage, President Obama, when he came into power, he sought to stop and block certain things from being made public because the Saudis were actually threatening to pretty much destroy the American economy if the laws that allowed this lawsuit to be taken were enabled. Um, you're up against an incredibly powerful lobby, aren't you? Let's be honest about it. The American government doesn't want
Yes.
to insult the Saudis. They may not like them. They certainly, I know for a fact, they don't like the Wahhabist extremist Islam that they were promoting through their madrasas all around the world, including in my neck of the woods in Indonesia. But they've got to get on with them. And let's be politically pragmatic for a moment. There's still a hell of a lot of redacted information that
Yes.
you and your lawyers want to get your hands on because you think there's more evidence behind the redacted documents that so far you haven't been allowed to see? What do you know about what's behind those redactions? Do you believe that those documents show even greater evidence of Saudi government complicity in the 9/11 attacks?
Yes, 100%. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so heavily redacted and they'd let us see everything. Everything we know that gets uncovered, the 28 pages, Operation Encore, what was in Bayumi's apartment. It's always tied to the Saudis. So yeah, they're still protecting them, and it's extremely frustrating. And the families are getting older. You know, we've lost a lot of family members, parents that have died without any justice for their families, and this is a terrible travesty of justice to allow this lawsuit to go this many years. And the Saudis have not, from what I've seen, produced any evidence. You know, they just want to be dismissed from the case. That's why we just had another hearing on their motion to dismiss, is because that's their defense, is just dismiss us.
So I'm quoting from the lawsuit here. Basically, the lawyers representing Saudi Arabia, they challenged the lawsuit on the basis that um, they deny that Saudi officials directed support to the hijackers or were otherwise complicit. They say Thumari did not assist the hijackers at all.
Oh,
And they said that his alleged actions would not have fallen within the scope of his official responsibilities. They say that Bayumi's assistance was minimal and unrelated to terrorist activity, and neither he nor Thumari belonged to a jihadist network.
oh,
They say the Capitol view, you know, the video that we're talking about, is nothing more than a typical home movie by an enthusiastic tourist.
yes.
And the San Diego video of Bayumi's party in the hijacker's apartment is just a gathering of mosque goers for some purpose unrelated to the presence of two newly arrived Al Qaeda terrorists. So,
Yep.
what do you think is going to happen? Obviously, there's still arguments toing and froing in the court. Often the best fun in a court case happens with the argy-bargy, the argument about what documents and what evidence will be allowed in. Do you think that the lawsuit is going to be allowed to proceed with the evidence that you know is hidden behind those redactions?
Oh, I certainly hope so. I don't see how the judge could not keep them in the lawsuit and allow it to continue based on what I saw on the July 31st hearing, where all of this evidence was seen for the very first time. And the kingdom tells a story, but they have no evidence that ever can back up their theories. Because with discovery, we now have the phone records, and we never had that before. The phone records don't lie. You can't, and there were other videos found in the apartment of them with the cleric Alawaki, the known underwear bomber from California. You know, they're in a video with him. There's videos of them with Al Qaeda operatives. There are phone records of them speaking to Al Qaeda operatives, and there's money coming, you know, flowing in from charities through Al Qaeda. The kingdom doesn't even deny that they gave money to Al Qaeda. They're trying to deny that the government had anything to do with the 9/11 attacks. But you sent your government officials here to the United States, and they were known jihadist sympathizers. They were extremists. You were doing that around the world. Do we think the United States was immune to that? No. They were filling the mosques with extremists, and they put them in Moya and the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. And what happened next was a horrific, you know, plan and plot to use airplanes as missiles and to hit our landmarks and to murder Americans on American soil. That was Osama bin Laden's grand scheme, and the kingdom funded it and gave the hijackers everything they needed to carry out the attacks.
Let's go back to 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the days following 9/11. Let's do something that should have been done by the FBI and all of the intelligence services in the wake of that appalling attack on the American people. Yes, evidence starts emerging of Saudi complicity. We know that 15 of the 19 hijackers are Saudis. That's shocking in and of itself. Then you've got this ridiculous situation where Prince Bandar, the Saudi government senior official in the embassy in Washington is pleading with the Bush government administration to get all of these Saudi family people, the House of Saud family people, out of America as quickly as possible. But there's a no-fly over the entire continental USA. The FBI is being asked to help facilitate these families. Incredibly, there were police officers who were brought in to help these people get out of the country and get to an airport where they could be put on a plane and flown back to Saudi Arabia. What if, instead of putting all of these people onto the plane, they were deposed and made to do interviews with the FBI before they got onto the plane, and including some of the members of the bin Laden family themselves, who were later implicated in paying money to the Al Haramain charity that was actually funding some of these terror attacks? What if they'd actually taken statements from these people in 2001 before they were allowed to leave the country? And then what if they had aggressively investigated the probability that Saudi government officials were involved in these attacks? Because we now know, as you've rightly pointed out, and as your lawsuit demonstrates, we know that these two Saudi government officials were involved with these hijackers. What if the United States government, instead of tugging its forelock to the Saudi Arabian government and saying, yes, sir, no, sir, we don't want to lose your oil, what if they'd taken them on and said, this is appalling. This is outrageous. You are a friend of our country. You have attacked our country and murdered our citizens. You will get to the bottom of this now, and we do not care at all what it will take to get to the bottom of this. We will annihilate you if you don't give us the answers. What if the US had played tough with the Saudis and actually done the job of properly investigating what you're revealing now? Do you think we would have got a different result?
Yes, I do think we would definitely have gotten a different result. We would have gotten the truth instead of lies and cover up all these years.
Do you think that the lawsuit is going to be influenced by the American government? I mean, the government can plead sovereign privilege. I don't know what you call it over there, but over here in Australia, we have a thing called public interest immunity, which allows the government to basically disguise or hide anything it wants to hide that involves national security or international relations. If they don't want to upset a government and there's something stinky in a document they don't want revealed, they can hide it. Now, your government can pretty much do the same, can't it?
Yes. Yes, and they have done the same. That's why we haven't seen all of this information for nearly 2 decades. But the lawsuit with Discovery, and President Biden in 2021 issued an executive order that mandated our intelligence agencies to go back and declassify everything to the greatest extent possible. The FBI, the DOJ, the CIA have been dragging their feet. They do not cooperate with the executive order fully. But then other things have come out, like this evidence that was found in Bayumi's apartment. I mean, thank God we have that. And some of the heavily redacted documents, the representatives can see more than we can see. So a lot of names have been revealed over the years now. It wasn't just those two individuals. Yes, they were the ones tasking to help them directly, but they had dozens, 27 to 30 other Saudi officials helping them out. So it's it's just completely outrageous that this was kept.
It makes me very angry. And I mean, obviously you lost a loved one and obviously many friends in the attacks in New York. I mean, I saw what happened in Bali, and I'll never forget that. And to me, the thing that really shocked me was the tolerance that was shown by my government, by the Indonesian government, towards the Saudis, who were implicated in funding this poisonous Wahhabist, Islamist, really hateful strand of Islam. And I don't know if you know much about Indonesia, but when I first traveled there as a very young man, it had a beautiful form of Islam called Sufi Islam, which was a very gentle and kind form of Islam. And over the last 30 or 40 years, I've watched the radicalization of young people, including intelligent middle-class people, very rich people in Indonesia, who are being poisoned by this cancerous Wahhabist streak of Islam. And it led to the attacks of 9/11. And the thing that really shocks me from what you're saying is the cover-up about the Saudis' involvement in doing that. Even if they've changed their tune now, it continues to this day.
Yes, it does. I don't obviously how can I possibly know the reasons other than what I could imagine is that the kingdom or the Saudi government is the lesser of the two evils in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And if we can continue propping up the kingdom and that trying to keep some peace in the Middle East has to do with the survival of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But it doesn't excuse them for what they did. It doesn't excuse them for the spread of Wahhabism, this cancerous form of Islam that they financed and allowed to flourish. They unleashed the Frankenstein on the world, and innocent Americans were murdered on September 11th. And nobody should have to bear witness to the carnage left behind of a terrorist attack like you have witnessed and the rescue workers witnessed. And wherever a horrible attack happens, innocent people see things they can't unsee, and rescue workers and policemen, are part of that. They have to witness carnage. Nobody should. So I've really taken on this mission because I want justice for the 9/11 families. I want justice for the murder of my husband. But I also hope that we can deter future terrorist attacks by exposing this underbelly, the financial network that supports extremism. And yes, the kingdom was the father of Al Qaeda, and Sudan was its mother. That's where the terrorists were nurtured and trained and protected. Iran wasn't any better. So it's about rooting out the evil and trying to expose it and creating better policies going forward.
So where are you at with the lawsuit? What's the status of the lawsuit at the moment?
Right now, we are waiting for the judge to make his determination whether he will dismiss the kingdom or keep them in the lawsuit. So they have filed a motion to be dismissed. The hearing was on July 31st. It's where a lot of this evidence came out, and the kingdom had nothing to really show. The kingdom really was very weak in their arguments. They tried to tell the judge that the plane drawings and the trajectories that show calculations to hit a target on the ground were Bayoumi's son's homework. That was their defense. Bayoumi himself, in his own deposition, did not say anything about that being his son's homework. So that is how weak their defense is, because you can't defend the indefensible. So they really have very little, and they don't have things to argue in the court. All they want is to be dismissed. Because they know they don't have a case. And I'm really, we're on pins and needles here. The families, we're headed towards the anniversary. It's a very disturbing time of year for us. And the judge hasn't ruled yet. And we don't know when he will. It'll just come one day. We don't know yet.
How deep would this go for the families to see the judge throwing out the lawsuit against the Saudi Arabian government in light of what you know?
Oh boy. I don't want to live in a world where the poor families will have to go through something that traumatic to another dismissal, because they have been dismissed in the past, but they were dismissed before this discovery was ever happened. And now that we have all of this evidence, none of us can possibly imagine that they will be dismissed. But if they are, then we have to go back to the appellate courts and we have to appeal the decision. And we have to encourage Congress to enact legislation that solidifies what the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act was meant to do. And that is to be able to apply aiding and abetting correctly. So there's even sometimes a technicality that could cause a dismissal. We're trying to just tie up all the loose ends to ensure that that never happens. But the evidence speaks for itself. They were definitely complicit in the attacks at a level nobody knew before this evidence came out.
Well, Terry Strada, I think anybody watching this, at the very least, wants to make sure that you and all the other families of the victims of 9/11 get the opportunity to have your day in court. I think most Americans would be offended by the idea of the American government cravenly participating in a cover-up to conceal evidence of Saudi government complicity, if that exists. And I
Yes.
think that the simple fact that a government might feel cowed about allowing a lawsuit to go ahead because it's worried about the damage to the economy, there's no way that morally this should be allowed to be hindered. There should be an open and public accounting for what really happened in 9/11. And I think most people in the world would be behind you.
Yes, thank you. And you're absolutely right. Congress supports our day in court, right? They support legislation, and then they support our efforts. It's been our administrations, and it's been every single one of them. The Bush administration started it when they excised the 28 pages from the joint inquiry and fully redacted that. Then when President Obama came along, for 7 years, we were trying to get the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act enacted. 7 years, his entire presidency, and he vetoed it. When the 9/11 families had to go back to Congress and ask them to please, do your best to override the veto, and they did. And that was the one and only veto override of his entire presidency. So he was no help to us. He never wanted us to have our day in court. And then comes along President Trump. And now we're in the courtrooms. We just need the evidence. And we go to him personally, to Washington, D.C., to the White House on the 19th anniversary of September 11th. Family members, I was one of them, and asked him to please, release this evidence. And the very next day, AG Barr stamped state secrets across everything. And it was an egregious abuse of the state secrets process, because you can only, in this country, apply state secrets if it's a threat to national security. And there was no threat to national security having any of this released. So what happens after Trump leaves office is President Biden comes in and he issues we go for the Transparency Act, the 2021 Transparency Act. I was there in front of the Capitol introducing the bill, and within months, or very short amount of time, Biden picked up the legislation and he used the language and he wrote this executive order, and he said, give them everything to the best that you can. And the FBI still held on to all of that Bayumi evidence. So our intelligence agencies do not cooperate, and they do not help us. And the administration is who the Department of Justice answers to. So again, Congress really cares, and they do the best that they can. And that's why I need them to enact the Ensuring Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, because that's a technical fix to the Bill JASTA. We just need to make sure that our laws are as strong as they can be to hold sponsors of terrorism attacks responsible in a courtroom. But it's been every administration. Doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat. Everyone comes in and they get told somehow, somewhere, that you're going to side with the Saudis and you're not going to help the families.
Well, Terry Strada, you are a formidable advocate for your cause. And if I was the Saudi government or the American government trying to cover this up, I'd be putting up the flag of surrender. So I think everyone wishes you the very, very best in your lawsuit. Justice is all about shining light onto things that aren't being revealed. And so we wish you all the best. And thank you so much for joining Reality Check.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.